we at CIBC Asset Management really appreciate the opportunity to speak with you today and to discuss about ESGI and how we can integrate responsible investment for the next generations. At any time during these presentations, please don't hesitate to raise your hand and ask questions. Our goal is to make this workshop as collaborative as possible. We CIBC, we also like to take the time to acknowledge the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Musqueam, the Tsleil-Waututh, and the Squamish Nation on whose land today we gather in a good way to share information and create new relationships. With us today, we have our CIBC Asset Management Sustainable Investment Leader, Aaron White. Want to introduce yourself?
Thanks, Jeff, and thanks everyone for the time today. Really happy to be here. As JF mentioned, I'm the Vice President of Sustainable Investments at CIBC Asset Management. I work directly with our investment teams to enhance our ESG investing policies, procedures, as well as work directly with clients to develop custom solutioning to meet the unique needs of their communities and to align their investments with their values.
So Indigenous communities have long played an important role in building environmentally and socially responsible futures, and we believe this can be carried over into their investment. These investments can provide positive impact for today, tomorrow, and for next generation. So in today's discussion, we will enlighten responsible investment, and we'll also guide you on the way how to integrate responsible investment in your investment policy guideline. And we'll also discuss about climate change and Indigenous reconciliation. So without further wait, Aaron, we'll just speak about responsible investing and maybe what's ESG to start with.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Jeff. So we're going to try and keep this a little bit more informal. We don't have any prepared remarks, so I'm going to have JF sort of moderate a discussion with myself. And so with that, what I'd like to welcome the audience to do is to raise your hands, interrupt me. We really want to make sure that you get the most value out of this presentation that you can take back to your communities and back to your trusts. So first, I'm going to say, let's forget about everything we've heard about from related to ESG before today's session. There's a lot of misconceptions about what ESG is and what ESG investing is. So let's start by defining ESG. Many individuals within our industry have created it as a bucket of a way to invest, but really what it is three separate factors related to both risk management and values integration related to your investment portfolios. So firstly, environmental factors. These are considerations like climate change, how a company interacts with the communities and the environment with which they operate, their environmental policies, focused on things like water use and energy conservation. Next, we have social, which is more related to health and safety, diversity and inclusion policies internally at the organizations. For larger sort of tech conglomerates, we look at things like privacy and how they utilize their customers' data and protect that data. And then lastly, governance. This is obviously one of the most important factors of investing, having a strong governance practices within an organization, as well as good, strong governance leads to better action and better policies from an environmental and social perspective. So when you think ESG investing, oftentimes you have a unique view of what that means to you, and that's okay. But ultimately, what we're trying to accomplish here is determine these non-financial factors that relate to investing or relate to the companies with which we invest and create a structure for your portfolio allocation, whether it means divestment from certain asset classes or harmful sectors related to the ESG, or whether it's about reducing overall risk by investing in better and higher quality companies. The last thing I want to mention is I've heard a lot of discussion throughout this conference about the I component and whether I relates to integrated within the E, within the S, within the G, or whether it's its own separate factor. And the way that we would look at this from the construct of ESG is that each of these individual E, S, and G factors have their own unique relations to Indigenous communities. but ultimately the I, from an operationalization perspective in your investment portfolios, can have your own unique views and values reflected in your investment portfolios. And so I is certainly important across each E, S, and G factor, but also can be its own isolated factor when it comes to developing your IPG and developing your responsible investing policy. So when it comes to approaching responsible investing, there are many ways to do it. As I mentioned, there's no one size fits all. We've sort of categorized it into 4 unique buckets here. But on the next slide, we'll show you that it's much more of a spectrum. So because you employ ESG integration does not mean that you can also not employ thematic investing at the same time. So let's define each of these buckets. Firstly, ESG integration. This is the most common form of ESG investing. It now represents well over 50% of all invested assets globally. If many of you may have heard of the United Nations Principles of Responsible Investing, that now encompasses over 4,000 global signatories, representing over $125 trillion of assets under management. And investment managers who adhere or agree to adhere to those principles agree to integrate ESG risks, as well as be active owners and stewards. We've had some presentations already today talking about stewardship, and we'll highlight some of the ways with which you can integrate stewardship, so proxy voting, leveraging your voice in the companies you own to ultimately impact the way companies interact with your own communities. Next is socially responsible investing. This is where traditionally you exclude particular harmful sectors. We're seeing some momentum growing towards fossil fuel divestment as part of this category, where we've seen significant institutional investors commit to no longer investing in fossil fuel companies. That now represents over $15 trillion globally and is continuing to gather momentum. Next is sustainably themed investing, and this is where you're seeking some form of sustainable outcome to take advantage of opportunities or reduce risk. Think about investing in the energy transition, investing in companies that are focused on clean water, or access to microfinancing in Africa, for example, to facilitate growth in underserved communities. And then lastly, impact investing. This is the culmination where we would consider the end of the spectrum, where you're integrating the risk analysis from ESG integration, but you're also seeking to generate a positive non-financial return with your investments alongside that financial return. And this can be either concessionary or non-concessionary, and we'll talk about that a little bit on the next slide where we have the ESG investing spectrum.
Yeah, so to summarize, there are different approaches to responsible investment, and each of these approaches can help to reach sustainable goals based on beliefs, culture, and values. So the next slide is going to speak about the intention and features of the different approach we mentioned. And
Thanks, Jeff. So when we think about ESG integration, the primary objective of investing in that manner is to reduce overall risk. So when you think about a company's approach to stewarding the land with which they operate, a mining company or an oil and gas company, how they return land post extraction, how they think about water use and conservation. When you think about reducing risk from a governance perspective, so do they have independent boards and chairs? Do they have all the proper policies and procedures throughout the organization to make sure that there's unbiased, accountable action within the corporation? Ultimately, all you're trying to do is reduce risk. So if a company is a poor ESG actor, let's say they have no plans or policies related to environmental remediation, they have a poor safety record, for example, that wouldn't prohibit you from investing in that company, but what you need to do is ensure that that risk of investing, those non-financial factors, is priced into the security before you invest. The next, as you start moving deeper into the ESG investing spectrum, what you're focused on is more of the outcomes related to the portfolio, the portfolio companies that you're investing in. So where in ESG integration, you may invest in a poor ESG actor. As you get deeper into the spectrum towards impact investing, you would not be investing in those companies, or you'd be actively using stewardship to push companies forward in order to affect change within their organization, to make them better stewards within their communities for the environment and other factors. So on this chart, you can see how ultimately each of these ESG investing strategies can deliver competitive financial returns, regardless of those non-financial benefits to you as investors. And that's one of the misconceptions that we see about ESG and integrating your own values into your investment portfolios, is that it comes as with the consequence of not generating those competitive financial returns that can ultimately lead to your trust being able to deliver on its financial objectives. And that's absolutely not the case. We are able to integrate your values, integrate these robust risk analysis frameworks to make sure that we're aligned with your intent for your capital and ultimately meet your financial objectives.
Would you be able to explain what's the difference between market rate and concessionary rate, maybe a bit further?
Yes, so if you're investing in an impact strategy, so most impact strategies will have a specific objective. Private markets are often a lot more conducive to investing for impact because you have more direct control on how the capital is being allocated and what the companies are intending to accomplish. But market rate returns would mean that your investment return would be in line with the benchmark or actually seeking to outperform the benchmark. So if you think about investing in the TSX and Canadian equities, your impact strategy would perform in line with Canadian equities or outperform it. Whereas in concessionary rate return impact strategies, you're seeking greater degrees of impact and sacrificing some of your financial return to do that. These would be strategies where, for example, it could be an investment fund that wants to advance social programs within an Indigenous community, and there is some financial return to doing so, but it's not at the market rate of financial return.
And is it only on the capital market that these ESG sustainable investing spectrum can be applied, or it can also be applied on the private market?
Yeah, absolutely. It can be applied to both private and public markets.
Great. So the next agenda items we'll just discuss about climate change and energy transition. As you may be aware, transition to a low carbon economy is critical to control climate change. And Aaron's gonna answer to several questions about that topic. The first one is why is climate change so important for the future generations?
Yeah, so climate change, particularly as it relates to investing and more directly to your actual communities, is one of the largest existential threats that we have as a society to overcome in the next 30 years and then beyond to 2100. What we're looking at here is 5 separate pathways. And this is looking at scope 1 and 2 emissions. I don't want to get into the nitty-gritty of what those are, but essentially how each company and individual is emitting GHG emissions, which ultimately causes warming in the atmosphere. These scenarios are starting at a baseline of where emissions are today, and then looking at if we continue as business as usual as the top line, and the most aggressive line is if we halve our emissions by 2030, as well as and then continue to reduce emissions from 2030 to 2050, which each of those scenarios will result in, which we'll talk about on the next slide. But the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change is the one who has released these statistics. They're a group of 170 countries who collaborate on research related to climate change and ultimately establish recommendations for how we're best to proceed with climate change plans. And they've really raised the flag in their report at the end of 2021 and their follow-up reports so far in 2022. Where they've indicated we are not able to now achieve the objectives of the Paris Agreement for 1.5 degree warming scenario. The best case scenario now is about a 1.7 degree scenario, and that's with that most aggressive reduction strategy. If we do nothing, we're going to achieve a 4 degree warming scenario by 2100. And just for some context, that 4 degree warming scenario will have 25% of Vancouver underwater. And Canada is actually one of the least impacted countries. And you can imagine that these negative effects will impact the most marginalized communities around the world, including many Indigenous communities who will be subject to greater degrees of forest fires, extreme weather, more hail in the prairies that will damage crops. So ultimately, climate change is important from an actual integrated risk of various Indigenous communities around Canada, and then also from the perspective of your investment portfolios, this is one of the most greatest risks to investment capital going forward over the next 75 years that we've ever seen in the investment industry. Flipping to the next slide, JF, just to sum up, each of those scenarios, you can see the most aggressive reduction strategy still will result in a 1.7 degree warming scenario. These lines are indicating the statistical variance of the possibility. So even under the most aggressive scenario, there's a possibility that it's a 1.9 degree warming scenario. You can see each of those reduction pathways leading to substantial warming scenarios by 2100. So as investors, we have typically only bared the cost of internal costs. And what I mean by that is paying your suppliers, paying for transport, paying employees. We've been able to put external costs on society, and that will no longer be the case. So we are going to see governments across the world integrate strategies where we'll have to pay for all of those internal costs as part of investing. And under the most aggressive scenarios, that does have impact on capital markets today and the costs that companies will have to outlay. But ultimately, those will be less costly for the next generations as we bear the costs of actually solving for some of the climate challenges that will occur under the worst case scenarios.
That's good, thanks. So maybe if you can just discuss about what is about net zero by 2050, what does it mean, and what a company needs to become net zero by 2050?
Yeah, so we've seen a lot of commitments in the financial markets today from companies to be net zero by 2050, and that means that they have to eliminate, most of the commitments are focused on, again, I don't want to get into the nitty gritty, but their scope 1 and 2 emissions being zero by 2050. What we've seen is less aggressive commitments for 2030, which is really the critical time frame now to get emissions in half. So what we're focused on, particularly when we engage with our investee companies, is pushing them to be more aggressive and be more accountable to ultimately reducing those emissions. And then by 2050 being a zero or a net negative emitter, which we're seeing some companies already commit to. But there'll be many industries that'll be more impacted. So the extractive industries where it's much more difficult to be net zero, the transport industries, and we'll talk a little bit about some of the harder to abate sectors a little bit later. So this is what we're seeing in 2018. This was the distribution of energy production. You can see very little renewable sources of energy. And by 2030, these are the forecasts to see how the globe is ultimately transitioning. And so these will have impacts for many Indigenous communities who are in extractive industries, particularly have been able to generate wealth through oil and gas in northern communities, as well as through land leases for pipelines and other transport activities from Western Canada. As we continue to transition away to a more renewable source of energy, these communities will have to establish other sources of revenue and pathways to participating in this transition. And so we mentioned some of the areas with which we have emissions distribution. You can see all the various sectors and where those emissions are being produced globally. And you can see some of the sectors which are much more difficult to abate. So transportation, you immediately think electric vehicles. That only solves for a small percentage of emissions. You also have transport, shipping, long-haul trucking. These are much more difficult challenges to solve for and make up a significant portion of emissions. Energy use, of course, so the production of electricity. And then you also have other hard-to-abate sectors like iron and steel production, as well as concrete production. And these are actually some significant opportunities for communities where they'd be closer to renewable sources of energy. So particularly in northern Quebec, where we have a significant amount of hydroelectric power, those areas are set up very well to develop clean concrete and clean steel manufacturing, where you have that concentrated source of renewable power to fuel the production of those activities. So net zero, we talked about companies getting to zero. That's going to be very hard for some companies, but also to get that last mile of emission reduction is going to be another challenge, because while you can take on renewable sources, you can increase efficiency, to get to zero emissions is very challenging. And so we will have to rely on carbon offsets or the carbon markets to do that. We're seeing now an increase. There's two types of carbon markets. There's the regulatory market, which is where the government establishes a cap on emissions, and you trade those credits back and forth based on how much, if you emit under your cap, you can sell those credits back to another who emits over their cap, and the government will ultimately continue to control emission caps downward to force companies to pay for the transition. But then you also have the emerging voluntary markets, and this is where you create offsets through nature-based solutions, so planting new forests, for example, or the development of new technologies that actually pull CO2 out of the air and you sequester that underground. These credits are developing into a much more robust and tradable market, and this will create another opportunity for some Indigenous communities who have significant amounts of land where they can reforest, create sustainable agriculture where they can sell and actually generate revenue to offset emissions for these companies to reach net zero. Cap and trade is very popular, but you have to be part of the system to trade them. Voluntary markets, you don't have to be part of the system. So for example, CIBC, as part of our sustainability report, we have a team that buys voluntary credits to put into our sustainability report that we're reducing our emissions via carbon capture. Voluntary markets are extremely variable today. The quality of the credits range from ultra high quality, new reforestation, all the way down to really low quality credits. And so there are currently some trading systems that are developing. CIBC is actually a partner in what we call Carbon Place with 8 other banks today, and continuing to add new entities onto it to create an online system that verifies the quality of credits and ensures that they're retired once they're exchanged. And so as we continue to build up this type of infrastructure to be able to trade these credits, develop a price, a standard market price, at that point, communities will be able to go out and obtain financing to produce credits to sell into that market. So we're still in the early stages, but it's rapidly developing, and it's certainly something that you would want to keep your eye on if you live in a remote community where this is a possibility to be a revenue line for you.
Mm-hmm. As an example, last time I've been there for the FNNPC, I've met a company. Their goal was to plant trees in indigenous communities. So a bank, for example, could pay that company to plant trees in the community to decrease its carbon offset. So as an investor, considering aligning their investment with their mission and values, it's important to know that this is a process that can be implemented incrementally over time. There are no right or wrong way to do it. We recognize the process should be ever evolving. Aaron, maybe would you like to explain the process of integrating responsible investment into the investor investment policy statement?
Yes. So the way we view it is, as JF mentioned, that this is a continually evolving process. You don't have, it can be very overwhelming to get started, to think, okay, what are our community's values? How do we want these reflected? How do we marry that with our existing investment portfolios, and ultimately how that may have to change over time? It doesn't have to be completed 100% right off the beginning. So thinking through the priorities within your community and within your organization as to what values you want reflected. There's two ways to integrate them, either in your investment policy guidelines directly or in a responsible investing policy that all of the investment managers that manage your capital on your behalf need to adhere to. We recommend that you think through stakeholder input, and that can be through representatives on your community. So council, for example, could be the ones that consider what's in the community's best interest and what aligns with their values. Or you can open it up to a much broader forum that can ultimately take additional time to complete, but involves all the stakeholders within your community to make sure that everyone's voice feels like it's being heard. So once you establish that community missions and values statement, it's then about thinking through how that is going to fit in terms of investing. And so that can be through things like investing along that ESG spectrum. It can be also related to active stewardship. We heard a presentation yesterday from the RRII, as well as SHARE, talking about stewardship activities, so ensuring that your ownership stake makes your voices heard within the companies that you invest. And there's also significant numbers of collaborative engagements and organizations that you can become a member of that ultimately make sure that those values are represented from a larger audience and a larger asset base. Once you've developed those values and ultimately how you want to make sure they're reflected in your investment portfolios, you develop that framework, that responsible investing policy. We at CIBC work very closely with our clients to help them establish what that value set is and ultimately direct the appropriate language within your policies to make sure that the outcomes you want to achieve are being accomplished within the investment portfolio. One of the things that I would say is really important here is that oftentimes that communication between consultants, investment manager, and trust can be more of a one-way dialogue. And what we hope to achieve with our clients is more of a two-way continuous dialogue so that we can understand the non-financial needs of your community alongside us simply investing on your behalf to make sure that we are constantly evolving our approach to meet your unique needs. And so we would encourage you to connect with your consultants, connect with your investment managers, discuss your own community's values, and make sure that there is a dialogue that is occurring to accomplish those outcomes. And then lastly, we sort of mentioned some of the ways with which you can implement and execute those strategies. But it's important to, again, have that constant communication to understand where you want to accomplish your goals and then how you can be supported via your consultant and investment manager.
Maybe can you speak about maybe a bit more about responsible investment framework? What's about a responsible investment framework? Is it included in the IPS or the trust policy guidelines? What is where it is?
Yeah, so you can have it directly housed within your IPS and have very specific restrictions and objectives. Often what we recommend for our clients and prospective clients is to refer to a responsible investing policy inside of the IPS. And that responsible investing policy can then be updated more regularly and can evolve much more rapidly than a more formal review of the investment policy statement or guidelines. When it comes to the responsible investing framework and the policy, we would recommend that you truly think through less about the specific and more about the broader outcome that you want to achieve with that capital. So we have some clients, for example, that focus on indigenous interaction with indigenous communities at the companies with which they invest, and we monitor for controversies, lawsuits, and other activities that show that a company is not participating appropriately, and then flag those issues back to the investment community to ultimately make a decision on action. So again, it doesn't have to be very binary in a sense where it's invest or don't invest. It can be that continued active dialogue with your investment manager to make sure that the right objectives and the right outcomes are being achieved.
So if a company harms indigenous rights, for example, what an indigenous community can do? Can they do, for example, investment restrictions against that company? What are the options?
Yeah, so that's certainly, divestment is always an option. Of course, you remember that if you divest, you no longer have a voice at the company. And so working with your investment manager to ensure that they're engaging with company management and boards on the right issues and the issues that are important to you is a way that you can make sure that you're affecting change within that company to again, achieve that outcome you want to accomplish. Sometimes when you just divest, which is always an option, and of course we always recommend as a last resort, you lose that voice, and ultimately the company will likely not change.
And is this type of investment approach, ESG, and also restrictions, can be implemented to all type of investors, or it's specific to a certain institutional grade investor?
So the amazing part about the surge of interest around ESG is that it's created more opportunities for every size investor to integrate these values, and you don't just have to be a billion-dollar trust that can create a customized solution with an investment manager. There's lots of opportunities to participate in collaborative engagements with other organizations, to work with organizations like Share, for example, who can advocate on your behalf and ensure that your managers are integrating those factors as part of their engagement and proxy voting guidelines. So now more than ever, values integration is more accessible and more possible for every size trust and plan. Yes?
Is this a common theme among most investors and investment managers?
We are seeing a significant increase in the level of interest in terms of developing custom responsible investing policies, and then even the larger investors developing very specific custom investment strategies that meet those values needs for their investor base. Over 5 years ago, I would have very minimal direct discussions with investors on this topic. Now it seems like several times per month we're looking at IPGs and responsible investing policies and thinking through how we can make sure that the right outcomes are being achieved for investor capital.
Thanks, Aaron. So to summarize, your investment professional and your investment manager should help you to identify your value, your culture, and also to identify the purpose of your capital. And with this being said, I think it's just a matter of asking and engaging with people. And as an asset manager, we want to speak with our clients and ask them for their feedback. It's always discussing and being able to understand what mattered the most to the community. What's mattered the most for the next generations? Is it because all our decisions are also for the next generations? So that's how we should see our investments, not just about getting the best returns or getting the investments that are fitting only our financial needs, it's also non-financial. Maybe now we're just going to discuss about Indigenous reconciliation. I have maybe a question for you, so to the audience, what are you expecting from your asset manager or your financial institution discussing about Indigenous reconciliation? I think it's also getting discussion and understanding the needs. It's always about, like I said, again, discussing and engaging with communities and understanding what's about, do you need financial literacy? I find there's a large need in financial literacy within our nations. Is it about having employment opportunities for our community members? There are several points that we can discuss. That's what we're going to discuss in the next slide. So Aaron, maybe you want to start with the first few points?
Yeah, so I think you hit the nail on the head in terms of the way we're thinking about economic reconciliation, and Indigenous peoples have a unique perspective that's important as we think through the future of financial markets, and unfortunately are currently virtually unrepresented in our industry. We're working on programs and opportunities to change that. But it's a very challenging process when young indigenous peoples don't have role models that are in the industry. So, it's not an easy answer, but it's certainly, as an organization, we're very much committed to thinking through and working with our Indigenous clients to understand their viewpoint on how we can best advance those opportunities and create roles and integrate the unique perspectives of your communities into our institutions and into ultimately our industry.
Exactly. It's not only having harms to the community, it's also about Indigenous representation within the organization, also the numbers of board of director, for example, the executive leadership. Is there other components an organization, not just a financial institution, can take to address Indigenous reconciliation within their organization? So, just for example, analyze quantitatively or qualitatively, the commitment of companies. That's something you should expect from your financial institution. Right now, in the ESG analysis, there's few way that Indigenous, there's a few to none Indigenous people are not really represented in ESG framework, and that's what an investor could argue with its asset manager to see and view how we can improve this all the other criteria.
And this is really where I think the I comes into the ESG factor is when you think about ESG integration, which is the bulk of the assets that are managed under these frameworks, it's about risk analysis. And so if an investee company of ours doesn't have an approach to reconciliation and a robust policy that we think is actionable and will affect change, ultimately that is very immaterial financially to the company, and so is not a major factor as part of the ESG integration approach. So you have to have a separate priority as an organization to work with your investee companies on what they believe reconciliation is, and ultimately how they're working to accomplish the unique objectives based on where their organization is predominantly located and the industries with which they operate in.
Yes, and the private side as well. Before a bank invests or provide a financing to a company, maybe they could ask to the nations, is it fine? Is the organizations that are looking to provide the loan and doing a community project in your nation, is it fine with you? Because sometimes they want to work or creating some project without the prior consent of the Indigenous communities, and that's something a bank can address as well, and asking if everyone agree and the prior consent.
And this is really where our ask of you is to really push more of that two-way dialogue. You know, I am a white settler male. I don't have a perspective that is Indigenous, unfortunately. And therefore, you know, as driving the guiding principles of our organization, we need input from our clients who are Indigenous to guide us in terms of the right next steps and how to best work with your communities in order to accomplish real, true reconciliation.
Yes. And maybe lastly, it's also about having an appropriate reconciliation action plan. If we invest in a company that doesn't have an appropriate reconciliation action plan, that should be something to address as well as an asset manager. When you want to invest, is there some point that can be implemented over time, and also some goals that you're looking to? Is there employment goals? Or is there scholarship goals? Because sometimes you can hire some Indigenous, but it will only be entry-level jobs, not maybe not the most profitable jobs. What's the framework, HR framework, do you have to improve the quality of the work your Indigenous employees are doing? So is there something in your goal and objectives that you can do to improve that? And maybe do you want to add about that? Or maybe
I think you summed it up well. I mean, you should really be looking for your investment manager, your consultants, your financial institutions to be truly committed to facilitating real reconciliation, real economic reconciliation, and putting in place the right policies and procedures inside their own organization, but also with their suppliers, with their investee companies, et cetera, to make sure that the whole financial markets are contributing to reconciliation.